On March 18, 2026, the world's largest natural gas field was set on fire. Within hours, the world's largest liquefied natural gas export facility was hit by a ballistic missile. A projectile landed just 350 meters from an operating nuclear reactor, and 5,000-pound bombs fell on fortified missile sites guarding one of the most important maritime choke points on Earth. All of this happened in a single day. The Iran War, now in its 19th day, is no longer just a military conflict between states. It has become something more dangerous, an energy war, fought across the arteries of the global economy, with consequences that reach far beyond the Persian Gulf. What happened on this day may well define the trajectory of this conflict and the shape of the world economy for months, possibly years to come. On Wednesday, March 18th, the Israeli Air Force struck facilities associated with Iran's South Pars gas field, the largest known natural gas reserve in the world, located offshore in Bushehr province. According to Israeli officials cited by Axios, the strike was coordinated with and approved by the Trump administration, though President Trump later denied prior knowledge in a post on Truth Social. The semi-official Tasnim news agency in Iran confirmed that petrochemical facilities near Asaluya were hit and that fires had broken out. Iran's Ministry of Petroleum acknowledged damage but reported no casualties. The Iranian response was swift and deliberate. Within hours, Iran's Revolutionary Guard published a list of energy facilities across the Gulf that it declared were now direct targets. The list included Qatar's Ras Laffan refinery and Mesaieed petrochemical complex, Saudi Arabia's Samref refinery and Jubail petrochemical complex, and the Al Hassan gas field in the United Arab Emirates. Iran then followed through. A ballistic missile struck Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial city, the complex housing the largest LNG export plant in the world, which before the war accounted for roughly 20% of global LNG supply, according to data from energy consulting firm Kepler. Qatar's Interior Ministry reported that 4 other missiles were intercepted, but the one that hit caused what state-owned Qatar Energy described as extensive damage. Fires broke out but were brought under control, and no casualties were reported. Separately, the United States Central Command announced it had struck Iranian anti-ship missile sites along the coastline near the Strait of Hormuz, using multiple deep penetrator munitions weighing more than 5,000 pounds each. CENTCOM stated that the Iranian anti-ship cruise missiles housed at those sites posed a direct risk to international shipping. And in another alarming development, the International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed that a projectile had struck the premises of Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant on Tuesday evening, landing just 350 meters from the reactor, according to the IAEA's assessment. No radiation leak, no casualties, and no damage to the reactor were reported, but the incident marked the first direct hit on an operating nuclear facility since the war began. The chain of events that led to this day stretches back decades, but the immediate trigger was February 28, 2026. On that date, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iran under what the Pentagon designated Operation Epic Fury. The strikes targeted military facilities, nuclear sites, and Iranian leadership, resulting in the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. According to Britannica's account of the conflict, it was the most dramatic opening salvo in a Middle Eastern conflict since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Iran responded with retaliatory missile and drone barrages against Israeli cities, U.S. military bases across the Gulf, and civilian infrastructure in several neighboring countries. By March 2nd, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps declared the Strait of Hormuz officially closed to international shipping. Tanker traffic plummeted to near zero. Insurance premiums for transiting the strait had already surged from 0.125% to as high as 0.4% of a ship's insured value, according to the Wikipedia timeline of the Strait of Hormuz crisis. For a very large oil tanker, that represented an increase of $250,000 per transit. But this war did not begin in February. It is the culmination of a long arc of escalation. The U.S. withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran in 2018, reimposing crippling sanctions. In June 2025, Israel and the U.S. launched the 12-day war against Iran, during which U.S. forces bombed 3 Iranian nuclear enrichment sites. In January 2026, Iranian security forces killed thousands of protesters in the largest domestic upheaval since the Islamic Revolution. President Trump threatened military action in response. The military buildup that followed was the largest U.S. deployment to the Middle East since 2003. In this context, the South Pars strike on March 18 represents a new threshold. For the first time, the conflict moved from targeting military and nuclear assets to striking the economic core of Iran's power. South Pars is not just a gas field. Together with Qatar's North Dome, it forms the world's largest natural gas reservoir, holding an estimated 1,800 trillion cubic feet of gas and 50 billion barrels of condensate, according to Iran International. It supplies roughly 70% of Iran's domestic natural gas consumption. The actors on this chessboard are numerous, and their interests often conflict in ways that defy simple alliance structures. The United States entered this war with stated objectives that include regime change, the dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program, and the protection of freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump has oscillated between signaling restraint on energy targets and issuing ultimatums. After U.S. forces struck Iranian military assets on Karg Island earlier in the week, Trump said the oil infrastructure on the island had been deliberately spared, but warned it could be hit if Iran continued to disrupt shipping. Now, with Israel hitting South Pars, the U.S. finds itself in a complicated position, aligned with Israel's actions but denying advance knowledge, while simultaneously trying to assemble an international coalition to reopen the strait. According to reporting by Stars and Stripes, the U.S. has struck more than 7,000 targets since the start of Operation Epic Fury. Israel has its own strategic logic. By targeting South Pars, Israeli officials told the Jerusalem Post that the aim was to send a signal about what would follow if Iran continued to disrupt oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. For Israel, this is about economic attrition, degrading Iran's capacity to sustain its war effort and its regional proxy network. The elimination of senior Iranian officials, including Ali Larijani and the Basij commander, through targeted strikes on March 17, underscores Israel's approach of decapitation combined with economic pressure. Iran, now under the leadership of Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the assassinated supreme leader, faces an existential dilemma. The country cannot match the combined military power of the U.S. and Israel. What it can do is impose costs. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz, attacks on Gulf energy infrastructure, and the deployment of anti-ship missiles, drones, and naval mines are designed to make the war expensive for everyone in the region, thereby pressuring Gulf states to push the U.S. toward a ceasefire. As Rob Geist-Pinfold, a lecturer in defense studies at King's College London, told Al Jazeera, Iran is banking on the idea that Gulf states will want a ceasefire as soon as possible and will pressure the Trump administration accordingly. The Gulf states find themselves in the most precarious position. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are not participants in the U.S.-Israeli campaign against Iran, yet they are bearing the brunt of Iranian retaliation. Qatar's Ras Laffan complex, the engine of the country's wealth, has now been hit twice. Saudi Arabia's air defenses intercepted 4 ballistic missiles aimed at Riyadh on March 18 alone. The UAE shut down its Habshan gas facility after debris from intercepted missiles fell on the site. These nations issued a joint statement condemning Iranian attacks and affirming their right to self-defense, but their strategic preference is clearly de-escalation. Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan stated that the kingdom reserves the right to take military action if deemed necessary. Russia, meanwhile, has a foot in multiple camps. Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear corporation, operates the Bushehr plant and has construction contracts for additional reactor units. Rosatom's CEO condemned the projectile strike near Bushehr, while the Russian Foreign Ministry demanded that the U.S. and Israel stop attacking nuclear facilities. But Russia's leverage is limited. It can condemn and call for restraint, but it cannot meaningfully shield Iran's infrastructure. The economic toll of this conflict is staggering, and March 18 accelerated it dramatically. Brent crude, the international oil benchmark, surged more than 5% to nearly $110 a barrel on Wednesday, according to Bloomberg. U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude climbed to approximately $98 a barrel. These figures represent a roughly 80% increase since the war began, according to Fortune, making this one of the sharpest oil rallies in years. European natural gas benchmarks jumped 6% on the same day, per Bloomberg's data from ICE Futures Europe. But the headline numbers only hint at the deeper distortion. Dubai crude, the pricing benchmark for Asian buyers, hit an all-time high above $150 a barrel the previous week, according to Fortune. The gap between WTI and Dubai crude widened to an unprecedented $50 or more, a spread that normally sits at $5 to $8. This reflects a severe physical scarcity of oil in Asian markets, where countries like Japan, South Korea, and India depend heavily on Gulf supplies transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The International Energy Agency responded with the largest emergency reserve release in its history, 400 million barrels, including 172 million from the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve over 120 days, according to CNBC. So far, these releases have done little to contain prices. U.S. gasoline prices have risen to their highest levels since 2023, with the national average climbing sharply, and California stations reaching over $5.56 per gallon, according to Fortune. For the LNG market, the picture is equally alarming. Qatar halted LNG production on March 2nd after the first attacks on Ras Laffan, and the damage inflicted on March 18th eliminates any prospect of a near-term restart. When production was first suspended, benchmark Dutch and British wholesale gas prices soared by almost 50%, and Asian LNG prices jumped nearly 39%, according to Al Jazeera. The country accounts for nearly 20% of global LNG exports, according to Kepler, feeding critical demand in both European and Asian markets. Oxford Economics modeled a scenario in which Brent crude averages $140 a barrel for 2 months, noting that this, combined with supply chain disruptions and tighter financial conditions, could push parts of the global economy into recession. The Center for Strategic and International Studies pointed out that resuming normal seaborne exports from the Gulf requires either a cessation of hostilities or the total neutralization of Iran's capacity to disrupt shipping, neither of which appears imminent. The events of March 18th have triggered a sharp debate among analysts about where this conflict is heading. According to Iran International's analysis, the Israeli strike on South Pars represents a deliberate shift toward pressure on economic systems and systemic vulnerability. By targeting gas infrastructure rather than military assets alone, Israel has signaled that Iran's economy is now a legitimate battlefield. The analyst Andres Kalla of energy intelligence firm Montel News told ABC News that this attack represents a serious escalation which threatens retaliatory strikes on Gulf and Israeli production facilities. The Center for Strategic and International Studies published a detailed assessment of the oil market dynamics. Their analysis noted that the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz has created the largest oil supply disruption in history, typically affecting 20 million barrels per day of crude oil and refined products, plus 10 billion cubic feet per day of liquefied natural gas. Resuming these flows, CSIS argued, requires either peace or the complete elimination of Iran's anti-ship capabilities, a task that could take months, even under optimistic assumptions. Roy Johnston, a commodities analyst cited by Fortune, wrote that nearly everyone expected the conflict to be resolved by now, and that the longer the strait remains closed, the more Asia's supply shortage becomes a global problem. Asian refiners are increasingly sourcing oil from further afield, which he described as a sign that regional scarcity could soon become global scarcity. Rachel Ziemba, a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security, told Al Jazeera that since Qatar's LNG production was already halted, the March 18th strike would not create a new immediate supply shock, but she warned that it could put further pressure on regional power supplies, a critical concern for Gulf states that depend on gas-fired electricity generation. On the nuclear front, IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi called the Bushehr incident a crossing of what he described as the reddest of all lines in nuclear safety. He told Fox News Digital that a direct hit on an operating nuclear reactor could cause atmospheric dispersion of radioactivity, which would be extremely serious. The incident evokes comparisons to the risks surrounding Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, which has been on the front lines of Russia's invasion since 2022, though Bushehr's coastal location on the Persian Gulf raises additional concerns about contamination of desalination plants that Gulf states depend on for their water supply. Some analysts see a narrow path to de-escalation. Jerusalem Post sources familiar with military discussions indicated that operations around the Strait of Hormuz could prolong the war by as much as 2 months. Others are less optimistic. Trump's rejection of Allied help, expressed in a Truth Social post on March 17th, and his statement that the United States does not need the help of anyone, suggests the U.S. intends to prosecute this war on its own terms, regardless of the timeline. The reverberations of March 18th extend to every corner of the global economy. In Asia, the impact is most acute. Countries east of the Gulf rely heavily on oil and gas shipments through the Strait of Hormuz. According to a report cited by UPI, South Korea's dependence on Gulf oil is raising concerns that a prolonged crisis could deliver a direct blow to its economy. Japan and Australia declined Trump's request to join U.S.-led operations against Iran, despite their own energy vulnerabilities. Dubai and Oman crude have reached record highs, and the physical premium for Asian oil deliveries over futures prices has widened to nearly $40, according to Fortune, an extraordinary dislocation that signals real-world scarcity rather than mere speculation. In Europe, governments have refused Trump's call to provide military support for reopening the strait. According to reports cited by the Wikipedia entry on the 2026 Iran war, U.S.-aligned NATO nations rejected the request on March 16, prompting Trump's public rebuke. France has expressed conditional willingness to help secure the strait, but not while active hostilities continue. The UK has deployed forces in a defensive role, intercepting missiles and projectiles in Qatar, Jordan, Iraq, and Cyprus, but has not participated directly in strikes on Iran, according to the UK House of Commons Library briefing. The food security dimension is also intensifying. The UN World Food Programme has warned that the conflict is driving significant long-term increases in global food prices. According to the Fertilizer Institute cited in Wikipedia's account, nearly 50% of global urea and sulfur exports and 20% of global LNG transit through the Strait of Hormuz. LNG is a key feedstock for nitrogen fertilizers, and its disruption threatens agricultural productivity in countries already struggling with food insecurity. For Iran's Gulf neighbors, the situation borders on existential. Saudi Arabia has been diverting oil to its Red Sea port of Yanbu via the east-west crude oil pipeline, while the UAE has rerouted oil through the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline to the port of Fujairah on the Arabian Sea. But these bypass pipelines have limited capacity, moving an estimated 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day compared to the 20 million that typically transited the strait. The shortfall is enormous, and the Red Sea alternative is itself vulnerable to potential attacks by Houthi forces. Several indicators will determine whether March 18th marks a turning point or merely another step in an escalating spiral. First, watch for the timeline on Ras Laffan. If the extensive damage to Qatar's LNG infrastructure proves to require weeks or months of repair, the impact on European and Asian gas markets will deepen considerably. Any further attacks on Gulf energy infrastructure, particularly on Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura refinery or the UAE's production facilities, would signal that the energy war is expanding beyond containment. Second, the Strait of Hormuz remains the central variable. The U.S. deployment of 5,000 Marines to the region, announced earlier in the week, suggests that Washington is preparing for a more forceful approach to reopening the waterway. Whether the deep penetrator strikes on Iranian anti-ship missile sites on March 18th are sufficient to degrade Iran's capability, or whether additional operations are needed, will become clear in the coming days. Third, the Bushehr nuclear dimension introduces a risk category of its own. The IAEA's response, the broader international reaction, and whether any further strikes occur near nuclear infrastructure will be critical to watch. A nuclear incident in the Persian Gulf would have consequences that dwarf any oil price shock. Fourth, diplomacy. Saudi Arabia was scheduled to host a meeting of foreign ministers from Arab and Muslim-majority countries in Riyadh. France's President Macron spoke with both the Emir of Qatar and President Trump on March 18th, urging a moratorium on strikes targeting civilian infrastructure. Whether any off-ramp materializes from these conversations will be decisive. Finally, the snapback sanctions triggered by European parties to the 2015 nuclear deal are set to return by the end of this week, adding another layer of pressure on Iran. The interaction between military escalation and economic strangulation will shape Tehran's calculus on whether to continue fighting or seek terms. What happened on March 18, 2026 was not just another day in a 3-week-old war. It was the day the conflict crossed a line that cannot easily be uncrossed. When energy infrastructure becomes a deliberate target for all sides, the war is no longer confined to the belligerents. It becomes a war on the global economy itself. The gas that heats homes in Tokyo, powers factories in Germany, and feeds the fertilizer supply chains that sustain agriculture in dozens of developing nations now flows through a battlefield. The distance between a missile strike in Qatar and a grocery bill in Nairobi or a factory shutdown in Seoul is shorter than it has ever been. Understanding that connection is no longer optional. It is the essential context for everything that comes next.